Hi, welcome to iEducator. This is Teacher Jeff. I'm an educator and an engineer by profession. And today we will discuss the topic how to write Chapter 2 Methods applying the APA 7th edition. Now, in today's lesson, there are four key areas that I'm going to be discussing today. First, we have the method of research. Second, we have the method of collecting data and development of the research instrument. Third, we have the sampling design. And finally, we have the statistical treatment of data. Now, in order for us to be guided under part one of our lesson, method of research. This includes the difference between quantitative versus qualitative research. And also, this includes the primary versus secondary data. And also, we have descriptive versus experimental method of research. And under part two, method of data collection and development of the research instruments, it is divided into two parts. First, we have the quantitative methods, and second, we have the qualitative methods. Now, under quantitative methods, it includes surveys, experiments, questionnaire, and registration methods. On the other hand, under qualitative methods, it includes interview or focus groups. We have observation, and we also have testing methods. And part three of our lesson, that would be the sampling design. And sampling design consists of the population size, the study population, the margin of error, the sampling technique used, the sampling size or the actual computation of the sample and the sample itself. And finally, the last part of our lesson, that would be the statistical treatment of data. And this part is divided into two parts. We have quantitative methods and we also have qualitative methods. Under quantitative methods, it includes how data is prepared before analyzing it, the software used to analyze the data, and the statistical tests as well. And under qualitative methods, we have the content analysis, the thematic analysis, and discourse analysis. Now, in order for us to get started, let us discuss part one of our lesson, and that would be the method of research. Now, take note that if we say research methods, these are specific procedures for collecting and analyzing your data. Now, developing your research methods is an integral part of your research design. Now, when planning your methods, there are two key decisions you will make. First, you decide how you will collect your data. Again, I would like to reiterate the very first key decision that you will make as a researcher is to decide how you collect your data. So in this case, your methods depend on what type of data you need to answer your research question. So is it a qualitative or a quantitative type of data that you will collect? Now, in this types of data, you will ask the question, will your data take the form of words or numbers? Now, if the type of data you will collect are in the form of words, then most likely the type of data you are employing is qualitative data. On the other hand, if your data take the form of numbers or numerical in nature, then the type of data you will collect is what we call quantitative data. On the other hand, is the type of data that you will collect is coming from primary sources or secondary sources. And so for that matter, you will ask the question, will you collect original data yourself or will you use data that has been already collected by someone else? Now, if the type of data you will collect is coming from original sources or original data, then most likely you will be collecting your data from a primary source. On the other hand, if you use data that has already been collected by someone else, then you are collecting secondary data. And finally, is the type of data you are collecting, is it descriptive or experimental? And so you will ask the question, will you take measurements of something as it is, or will you perform an experiment? Well, if you take measurements of something as it is, then most likely the type of data you are collecting is what we call descriptive type of data. On the other hand, if you as a researcher will perform an experiment, then most likely you are collecting an experimental data. And the second key decision that you will make as a researcher, that will be to decide how you will analyze the data. So after having collected your data, it is now time for you as a researcher to analyze your data. And in analyzing your data, there are two ways. First, we have quantitative, and second, we have qualitative data. For quantitative data, you can use statistical analysis methods to test relationships between variables. And we will be discussing these statistical analysis methods later on. On the other hand, for qualitative data, you can use methods such as thematic analysis to interpret patterns and meanings in the data. Remember, your choice of qualitative or quantitative data collection depends on the type of knowledge you want to develop. Now, for questions about ideas, experiences, and meanings, or to study something that can't be described numerically, then you collect qualitative data. On the other hand, if you develop a more mechanistic understanding of a certain topic, or your research involves hypothesis testing, then you collect quantitative data. Now, in order for us to better understand the difference between the two, then we should be able to determine the pros and cons of each type of data. Now, under qualitative data, as you can see on our presentation, one of the pros or advantages of qualitative data is that this is flexible, meaning the researcher can often adjust his or her methods as he or she goes to develop new knowledge. And aside from that, it can be conducted with small samples as well. However, the downside part of qualitative data is that it can't be analyzed statistically or generalized to broader populations. This means to say that the reason it can't be analyzed statistically because the nature of data is more on descriptive, not numeric. And so by that itself, it's very hard for the researcher to analyze the data statistically. And aside from that, it is also difficult to standardize research. And on the other hand, for quantitative data, one of the pros or advantages is that it can be used to systematically describe large collections of samples or things, and it also generates reproducible knowledge. However, the downside part of quantitative data, it requires statistical training to analyze data. So you need to be expert in terms of analyzing your data statistically, or if not, you need to get the assistance of an expert, such as a statistician. And aside from that, it also requires larger samples. So that makes it difficult for the researcher in terms of collecting quantitative data because you need to have larger samples. But you might be asking, is it possible to have a mixed method? Then the answer is yes. You can also take a mixed methods approach where you use both qualitative and quantitative research methods. And on the other hand, we have primary versus secondary data. So what's the difference between the two? Now, this is just a brief recap on what we discussed in the previous chapter. So the difference between the two is that if we see primary data, it is any original information that you collect for the purposes of answering your research questions, such as through surveys, observations, and experiments. On the other hand, for secondary data, it refers to information that has already been collected by other researchers. Examples of this would be in a government census or maybe previous scientific studies. So if you are exploring a novel research question, then you'll probably need to collect primary data. But if you want to synthesize existing knowledge, analyze historical trends, or even identify patterns on a large scale, then secondary data might be a better choice. Now, in order for us to better understand the differences between the two, we need to understand as well its pros and cons. Now, as you can see in our matrix, under primary data, one of the advantages or the pros is that it can be collected to answer your specific research question. When I say specific research question, you can collect primary data to answer the specific statement of the problem. Okay, you have identified maybe 4 or 5 research questions under your specific statement of the problem. And aside from that, you have control over the sampling and measurement methods as well. So the researcher has the control over its sampling and measurement methods. However, the downside part of the primary data, it is more expensive and time consuming to collect. Now, the reason it is more expensive and time consuming to collect, it is because, remember, in the previous slide, we made mention that primary data is collected from original sources. So meaning one of the sources of primary data is individual persons. So that is why it is hard to collect because it entails cost. So the researcher needs to travel from one destination to another destination just to conduct a face-to-face interview or survey to the original person or to the individual person himself. Okay, and it is also time consuming, and aside from that, it requires training in data collection methods, meaning to say you should be an expert first on how to collect the data correctly and how to analyze the data statistically, or if not, you need to get an assistance of an expert, maybe a statistician. And on the other hand, for secondary data, one of the advantages or pros is that it is easier and faster to access because one of the sources of secondary data is through, let's say, school libraries, okay? So the books, the sources coming from your school libraries, that is an example of secondary sources, and that makes it easier and faster to access. And aside from that, you can also collect data that spans longer timescales and broader geographical locations. However, the downside part of the secondary data, as a researcher, you don't have control over how your data was generated, all right? And also, it requires extra processing to make sure it works for your analysis, which happens a lot of time. And finally, we have descriptive versus experimental data. Now, in descriptive research, you collect data about your study subject without intervening. So the validity of your research will totally depend on your sampling method. On the other hand, in experimental research, you systematically intervene in a process and measure the outcome. And therefore, the validity of your research will depend on your experimental design. Now, to conduct an experiment, you need to be able to vary your independent variable, precisely measure your dependent variable, and control for confounding variables. If it's practically and ethically possible, this method is the best choice for answering questions about cause and effect. Now, in order for us to better understand each one of them, let us discuss the pros and cons of descriptive and experimental data. Now, as you can see in our presentation, one of the pros or advantages of descriptive data is that it allows the researcher to describe his research subject without influencing it, okay? You are not influencing your research subject because you are not doing any experiments, okay? And aside from that, it's also accessible, meaning the researcher can gather more data on a larger scale. However, the downside part of the descriptive data is that the researcher doesn't have any control over confounding variables, and he cannot establish cause and effect relationship as well. So technically speaking, for descriptive data, this is not applicable if you want to determine the cause and effect of a certain situation or subject, okay? On the other hand, for experimental data, the researcher has more control over confounding variables, and he or she can also establish cause and effect relationship because he or she is conducting an experiment or performing an experiment. But the downside of the experimental data is that you might influence your research subject in unexpected ways, and usually it requires more expertise and resources to collect data as well. So that means to say that you need to be an expert first on how to collect your data, or if not, you need to get an assistance of an expert or maybe a statistician. Now, going back to the pros of experimental data, in the first pro, you have more control over confounding variable. Now, if we say confounding variable in statistics, take note that a confounder is a variable that influences both your dependent and independent variables, causing a spurious association. Therefore, confounding is a causal concept and as such cannot be described in terms of correlations or association. In order for us to have a view of our data collection methods, so I have here presented a matrix of your research methods. It is either applicable for qualitative or quantitative data, or if the sources can be collected from primary or secondary, and as to when we will be able to use these types of research methods. Now, in order for us to better understand each of these research methods, let us discuss them one by one, starting with the experimental method. Now, as you can see, under experimental methods, the sources where the researcher can gather, it comes from primary sources or primary data. And this is more applicable for quantitative research, okay? And when can we use experimental research method? Well, we can use experimental method if the researcher wants to test cause and effect relationships, okay? On the other hand, for survey research method, the sources can be gathered from primary sources, and it is more applicable for quantitative research since this is more numeric in nature. So when can we use survey research method? Well, we can use survey research method if the researcher tries to understand general characteristics of a population. On the other hand, for interview or focus groups, the source comes from primary source, okay, or primary data, and this is more applicable to qualitative research, okay? So you're just briefly describing, okay, You are just getting the attributes or characteristics of a certain subject, may it be a place, an object, a situation, or etc. And when can we use interview or focus group? Well, we can use interview or focus group if the researcher wants to gain more in-depth understanding of a certain topic. And for observation research method, this is collected from primary sources, and it can be applied to both qualitative or quantitative research. And when can we use observation method? Well, we can use observation method if the researcher tries to understand how something occurs in its natural setting. And for literature review, the sources are coming from secondary sources. And same with observation, it can be applied either to qualitative or quantitative research. And we can use literature review if the researcher wants to situate his research in an existing body of work or to evaluate trends within a research topic. And for case study, it is applicable to either primary or secondary data, and it can also be applied both in qualitative and quantitative research. And we employ case study if the researcher wants to gain an in-depth understanding of a specific group or context, or when the researcher doesn't have the resources for a large study. The next key area that we're going to be discussing now, that would be part 2. And part 2 is all about the methods of data collection and development of the research instrument. Now, take note that in any statistical investigation, there are actually a lot of ways of collecting data. But unfortunately, none of the methods that we're going to be discussing later on would become the best method, because the choice of appropriate methods to be used largely depends on some factors, which include the definition of the problem, the research design, the time element of data collection, and the cooperation of the respondents as well. Now, under methods of data collection, we have 7 types, and one of those is the observation method. And the observation method is the most simple data collection technique. Here, the data are obtained by merely observing the behavior of persons or objects, but only at a particular time of occurrence. And the data obtained is called an observational data. In observation method, the researchers usually make use of their human senses. We have the sense of hearing, the sense of sight, the sense of smell, the sense of touch, and the sense of taste. Okay, so this is usually employed during observation method of data collection. And aside from observation method, we also have experimental method. In experimental method, it is especially useful when one wants to collect data for cause and effect studies under controlled conditions. And in this method, there is actual human interference with the conditions or situations that can affect the variable under study. And the data obtained in this method is called an experimental data. And aside from these, we also have testing method. And testing method is a specific type of measurement or measuring instrument, rather, whose general characteristic is that it forces responses from a pupil, and the responses are considered to be indicative of the pupil's skill, knowledge, attitudes, etc. So we will be discussing this one in detail later on. And also we have the registration method. Now, in registration method, the respondents provide the necessary information in compliance with existing laws. Now, for instance, data can be derived from car registration, birth registration, voters registration, and marriage registration as well. Now, aside from that, we also have the use of existing studies, which also provides an archival method of data collection. Now, in this method, the primary source is the source in which the data are measured or gathered by the researcher or agency that published it. And the secondary source, or the other hand, is the source from which any republication of data is made by another agency. And in the survey method, the desired information is obtained through asking questions, and the survey method or either be direct or personal interview method, and indirect or questionnaire method. Now, for direct or personal interview methods, there is a person-to-person contact between the interviewer and the interviewee. Now, this is considered as one of the most effective methods of data collection because accurate or precise information can be directly obtained and verified from the respondents. And moreover, this has a higher response rate but can only be administered to a respondents one at a time. And finally, we have indirect or questionnaire method. In indirect or questionnaire method, it is considered as the easiest method of data collection through the use of questionnaire or a data gathering tool. Now, unlike the direct method, this method has a lower response note but can be administered to a large number of respondents simultaneously. Now, in order for us to better understand observation method, let us discuss it in detail. Now, what do we mean by observation then? If we say observation as a means of gathering information for research, may be defined as perceiving data through the use of human senses. Like I said earlier, we have the sense of sight, hearing, taste, touch, and smell. Now, the sense of sight is the most important and the most used among the senses. And observation is the most direct way and the most widely used in studying behavior. Now, the purposes of observation are the following. So, one purpose is to enable the researcher to gather empirical data which are difficult to obtain by other means. Now, this is especially true in anthropological studies in which the life cycle, social and economic activities, the motivations and aspirations, and other practices of a group are to be described in detail. And the second purpose of observation that would be to enable the researcher to gather sufficient data to supplement or even verify information gathered by other means. Now, in order for us to better understand this, let me give you an example. So, for example, in a survey using the questionnaire, a certain library is rich in its collection according to the respondents. An ocular inspection, on the other hand, may verify this claim to be true or untrue. And additional information may also be gathered, all right? And the third purpose of observation is to enable the researcher to gather information or data needed to describe the aspect of a variable being studied, which cannot be described accurately without observation. Now, in case studies, for example, especially in clinical and psychiatric cases, observation of the behavior of the subject is a vital tool in gathering data for the case. And another purpose of observation that would be to enable the researcher to gather directly primary data or first-hand information for his study for a more accurate description and interpretation. And finally, the last purpose of observation is to enable the researcher to gather data from the laboratory or elsewhere through experimentation. Now, take note that observation enables him or enables the researcher to collect data through experimentation. And data gathered through experiment are more or less accurate, valid, and reliable because the variables involved are under the rigid control of the experimenter. Now, aside from purposes of observation, we also have types of observation, and types of observation is divided into three parts. First, we have participant and non-participant observation. Second, we have structured and unstructured observation. And finally, we have controlled and uncontrolled observation. Now, in order for us to better understand each of these types of observation, let us discuss them one by one, starting with participant and non-participant observation. Now, in participant observation, the observer takes active part in the activities of the group being observed. So here, the observer lives and works with the group for a certain length of time until he learns all the ins and outs of the aspect or aspects he is studying about. Now, examples of this would be anthropologists. So anthropologists do this usually when they make studies about tribal groups. However, participation or role playing is not necessarily complete because it is possible to take part in many activities of the group so as to be accepted as a member at the same time to carry on the role of observer and interviewer. Now here, the investigator may disguise himself in such a manner as to be accepted as a member of the group, although he may carry out exactly the same activities as the other members of the group in order to be accepted as a participant observer. And if the members of the group have accepted the observer as a participant, then their behavior and responses are least likely to be affected by the presence of the investigator. And on the other hand, in non-participant observation, the observer is a mere bystander observing the group he is studying about. So, meaning to say, he does not participate in the activities of a certain group, a certain tribe, etc. All right. So, another type of observation is what we call structured and unstructured observation. So, what's the difference between the two? If we say structured observation, it concentrates on a particular aspect or aspects of the variable being observed, be it a thing, a behavior, condition, or situation. Now, the items to be observed are usually specified for standard tabulation. This is usually used in non-participant or controlled observation. On the other hand, in unstructured observation, the observer does not hold any list of the items to be observed, meaning anything, be it an object, behavior, condition, or situation, which is relevant to the research problem is included in the observation. And this is usually used in participant or uncontrolled observation, okay? Now, finally, the last type of observation is what we call controlled and uncontrolled observation. In controlled observation, it is usually utilized in experimental studies in which experimental as well as the non-experimental variables are controlled by the researchers or are manipulated by the researchers. Here, the experimental variable is manipulated by the experimenter to produce an effect or effects upon the dependent variable. And the non-experimental variables are kept constant or equal in all aspects so that any change in the dependent variable is attributable only to the independent variable. Controlled observation is usually done in the laboratory. On the other hand, for uncontrolled observation, it is usually utilized in natural settings, meaning no control whatsoever is placed upon any variable within the observation area. For example, the farmers may be observed as they work in their farms. The dwellings of a tribal group may be observed as they are, etc. So uncontrolled observation is similar to unstructured observation and utilized in participant observation. So, what are the advantages and disadvantages of observation then? Well, the advantages of observation first, the investigator is able to gather directly first-hand information about the subject of his study. This kind of information is more accurate, more valid, and more reliable than any information gathered through other means. And another advantage, the researcher can observe his subject as long as he needs the time and as many times as he can for greater accuracy and validity in description and interpretation. And third, observation is a superior technique of collecting information from nonverbal behavior and inanimate objects, meaning the observer is in good position to discern the significance of an inanimate object or a nonverbal behavior. And finally, the subjects of the inquiry can be observed in their natural settings, and this will exclude artificiality in description and interpretation. So this is especially true in participant and uncontrolled and unstructured observation. On the other hand, the disadvantages of observation, though, is that in observation, in natural settings, there is actually a lack of control upon extraneous variables, which may adversely affect the validity of attributing certain causes upon certain effects. Now, what do we mean by extraneous variables then? Well, if we say extraneous variables, these are undesirable variables that influence the relationship between the variables that an experimenter is examining. So these are variables that influence the outcome of an experiment, though they are not the variables that are actually of interest. And moreover, these variables are undesirable because they add error to an experiment. So a major goal in research design is to decrease or control the influence of extraneous variables as much as possible. Now, in order for us to better understand what extraneous variable is, then let me give you an example. For example, a statistics teacher wants to determine the effect of incorporating technology on the performance of the students. And the teacher randomly assigns students to two groups with the conventional method of chalk talk method and the other group on the incorporation of technology. After one term period, they were given the same test. One obvious confounding variable in this case would be pre-knowledge of the topic that was studied. Now, this variable will most likely influence student scores regardless of which strategy they use. Because of this extraneous variable and surely others, there will be some spread within each of the groups. So it would be better, of course, if all students came in with the exact same pre-knowledge. So the second disadvantage of observation is there is a smaller size of sample if the universe covers a very wide area and the researcher cannot afford to observe a substantial area. So this makes description and interpretation less accurate and less valid. And third, it is difficult to quantify data for standard tabulation, especially in unstructured observation and when recording is done in the essay form. Fourth, sometimes it is hard to gain entry into the area to be observed. Now, this is actually true if the research problem is a sensitive or controversial one, such as, for example, a study on prostitution, graft and corruption, or even nude colonies. And finally, lack of anonymity makes the observed subjects withdraw or keep secret some vital but sensitive and controversial information. For example, in graft and corruption, the subjects may become very secretive. All right? So the characteristics of observation for research purposes. So take note that characteristics that distinguish observation for systematic investigation purposes may be differentiated from ordinary looking around as follows. First, we have observation is specific. So what do we mean by this characteristic? If we say observation is specific, the observation is specific not just looking around for general impressions with carefully defined things to look for. And if we say observation is systematic, observation of behavior for research purposes is systematic, not a chance jumping in on a situation at any time when one happens to be passing by. Therefore, the length of the observation periods, the interval between them, and the number have been carefully planned, etc. So there must be a system in the observation. And third, observation is quantitative. So the observation is quantitative, usually with a tally of the number of instances a particular type of behavior has occurred, or sometimes the total duration of the particular conduct during the period of observation, or some other countable or measurable characteristic. Sometimes a diagram is made showing spatial relationships. And number four, observation is recorded immediately, meaning a record is made of the observation immediately or as promptly as possible, not entrusting the results to memory. So it should be a camera recorded or video recorded. And also, observation is done by an expert. So the one conducting the observation is expert, that is, done by an investigator who is specially trained for such work. While many graduate students will not meet the conditions of this criterion, the difference between the observational skill of an investigator who is trained and a person who is not trained, both in the use of the technique and in the field to which the procedure is applied, is sufficient in itself to make the difference between valid and invalid results. For example, in psychiatric and clinical cases, the investigator observer must be well trained. However, in ordinary community and school surveys, the researcher observer need not be well trained to be able to gather data for his study. And finally, observation results can be checked and verified. So meaning the results of a systematic observation of behavior can be checked and often verified by comparing the results of different observers or by repeating the observation. Such checks, however, do not guarantee the validity of direct observation, which depends essentially upon the definiteness of the acts that are able to be regarded as falling within the category under study. So in many cases, validity rests ultimately upon the consistency with which the findings of different research approaches point to the same general conclusion. So the reliability of observation is behavior, however, can be determined and has often been found to be satisfactory. So in this case, how do we record the results of our observation then? Well, generally, the results of observation should be recorded immediately, meaning there are some forms for recording the results of observation, and they are as follows. So first, we have the checklist. So the checklist is a device which contains the items to be observed and is space for number and check marks or short verbal entries. So one example of checklist, that would be checklist with short verbal entries. So suppose a boy is to be observed in physical education, okay? So the items to be observed are listed down to be followed by short verbal description of each item, as you can see in figure 1. Now, as you can see in figure 1, it illustrates a checklist for observation in physical education. This is according to Bradfield and Murdoch, page 52. So as you can see on the sample checklist, so you have there the name of the student under study, the grade, the age, and the date. So you have their direction. Give a brief description for each item. So first you have the type of activity, And the student should need to describe briefly the type of activity. So meaning there are short verbal entries. Okay, so this is what we call short verbal entries. So you have interest, so effort, coordination, posture, skill in activity, sportsmanship, and other factors. So the students should give his or her short verbal entries for these particular item. And another example of a checklist with short verbal entries is the one you can see in figure 2. So this is still a checklist, and specifically, this is a sample checklist for observation in farming. So as you can see there, a name of observed. Okay, so that's optional because as much as possible, we need to have anonymity of our respondents. We also have place of observation where you conducted the observation and the date as well. So direction for observer, give a brief description of each item. And another, we have checklist that indicates the presence or absence of an item. So as you can see there, you have the name of the observed person, place observation, and the date. So direction for observer, fill the space before each item by a check mark or yes if the item is present, and no or leave the space blank if the item is absent. So that is an example of a checklist that indicates the presence or absence of a certain item. So for example, type of farming. So if dry is present, so I will have to say yes. If wet is absent, then I will have to say no or leave it blank, and so on and so forth. Okay. Another example of a checklist is what we call a dichotomous checklist. So in this checklist, there are only two possible answers. So that would be yes or no, or present or absent. So as you can see there, you have options for yes, and you have an option for no as well. So this is an example of a dichotomous checklist. So how do we design a checklist? Now, the steps in the construction of a checklist are as follows. So first, in designing your checklist, the first thing that you need to do is to enumerate or list down the dimensions or factors to be observed. And second, define them very clearly. So what they are exactly. And third, eliminate those that are vague or repetitive. So as much as possible, you need to be very clear, okay, understandable. And number four, arrange them on a sheet of paper in a manner most convenient for observing and recording. And number five, you need to include space for identifying data. Then try out the form, okay? In trying out the form, this is called a dry run, okay? Number seven, revise the form on the basis of the try out or dry run and your experience as well during the dry run of the checklist. And finally, write the checklist in its final form. Okay, so that's how you design a checklist. And another way of recording the results of observation is through rating scales. What do we mean by rating scales then? A rating scale is a checklist with an evaluation standard. So the types of rating scales are numerous, but some may be given. So in observing a pupil's behavior, the following may be followed. So for example, you have the name of observed. Okay, so this is the name of the pupil, the date, the school, the gender, the grade, and the age. So example one, direction for the observer. Rate the pupil in each trait listed by writing G on the space provided if the trait is good, and write B if it is bad. So health, posture, work habits, grooming. And example number two, direction for the observer. Put a check mark in the column that best describes the activity. Attends classes always, very often, usually, seldom. So this is an example of a rating scale. And another, you have there example number three. This is still an example of a rating scale. So direction for the observer, choose the phrase or statement that describes best the behavior or activity and write the number of the phrase on the space provided at the right of the phrase. So never gives up, persistent, that's 5. Persistent until convinced he cannot make it, rating of 4. Gives everything a fair trial, so you rate the child 3. Gives up easily even before a fair trial, that's 2. And never attempts to try, so that's going to be a rating of 1. So you have there the items. So the following items, we have sports, solving a mathematical problem, and memorizing a long poem. Okay, so that is an example of a rating scale checklist. Another example of a rating checklist is supposing your research study is about farming, okay? You are studying farmers. Now, suppose farming in a certain community is to be observed, okay? Now, the variables used to rate or evaluate farming paraphernalia and activities are satisfactoriness, industry, adequacy, fertility, efficiency, and appropriateness. Now, suppose also the variables mentioned are divided into categories or gradations, and each category or gradation is given an appropriate or corresponding weight or rank value as follows. So you have their weight. So in this case, you have 5 weights. So very satisfactory, satisfactory, fairly satisfactory, unsatisfactory, and very unsatisfactory. And you also have their lists of categories. So you will be making use of these categories and the weight as well. So direction for the observer, put a check mark on the space provided under the weight or rank value that which best describes the item. Okay, so for example, you have fertility of the soil. So how would you rate the farmer or the farm itself in terms of fertility of the soil? Would you say 5 or very satisfactory? Or would you say 4 satisfactory, and so on and so forth? Okay, so this is still an example of a rating scale checklist. Another way of recording the results of observation, that would be through anecdotal forms. So an anecdotal record is a checklist that provides for less breakdown of dimensions or factors, and hence much space is provided for writing. So it minimizes the use of highly subjective impressions on recording and obtains instead an objective description of behavior. So following is an example of an anecdotal record about a case study of a pupil taking physical education. So you have there the name of the observed, or this is the name of the pupil being observed. So direction for observer. In the space provided, record observations that bear on the individual's physical development and social development. Do not evaluate but describe. Again, avoid vague words such as good, strong, shy, etc. Enter statement of what happened, what you saw, as did 3 push-ups and couldn't do anymore, or cried and started fighting when he was called out. So date each entry. So you have there physical development and social development. So as much as possible, you need to describe what you really saw, what happened there during your observation. And also, you need to avoid using vague words such as good, strong, shy, etc. So this is an example of anecdotal form. So as a researcher, how can we make our observations more valid and reliable then? Well, the following must be observed by the researchers to make observations more valid and reliable. So the very first thing is to use observation where and when other data gathering devices cannot be used. Take note that there are behavioral activities where only observation can be used for collecting data. Examples are school subjects such as vocational education construction. We have physical education, say running, music, say singing, dramatics, say acting, or even speech, let's say oration, etc. In farming, the farmers may be observed in actual work for some data, okay? And number 2, In making your observation more valid and reliable, you need to use appropriate observation forms, just like what we discussed earlier. So use the checklist if very objective data are to be gathered. The rating scale if activities or things are to be evaluated or rated. And the anecdotal record if the activity is a complex one and it has to be observed in action. So use replayable mechanical devices for a more in-depth and accurate analysis of the aspect of behavior observed. So as much as possible, like I said earlier, you need to have your observation camera recorded or video recorded, but of course, with the consent of the one being observed. And number three, you need to record immediately, meaning the purpose of recording immediately what have been observed is to ensure that the things observed are recorded accurately. Now, if things observed are not recorded at once, then distortions may occur in the recording, and this makes the data gathered inaccurate and unreliable. So forgetting sets in immediately after an activity, and the observer has to record first before he forgets. And number four, be as objective as possible. So what do we mean by this? What we mean about this is that record exactly what occurred and rate or evaluate the person or activity observed without bias or preconception. Now, the results of observation and the study as whole will be faulty if biases or stereotype conceptions are allowed to interfere in the evaluation. And finally, you need to base your evaluation on several observations. For example, in science, the average of several measurements or trials is generally used as the basis for a conclusion. So this should also be so in observation. The average of several observations is admittedly more accurate, valid, and reliable than the result from one observation alone.